Hi, I'm David Gadd. I'm Professor of Criminology at the University of Manchester, and in this presentation, I'm going to give you a quick overview of some of the discoveries and findings that are emerging from the Making Change Meaningful project, which is a study of male prisoner survivors of sexual assault who are benefiting from the outspoken talking therapy service that is delivered in Northwest prisons in the UK. So while public interest in the issue of sexual assaults against men tends to dwell on the brutality of violence perpetrated by men in prisons against vulnerable inmates, there is considerable evidence to suggest high rates of prior sexual abuse victimisation among boys and men who enter the criminal justice system. This has been demonstrated in studies of convicted male sex offenders, around two-thirds of whom present also with personality disorders that are indicative of experiences of acute childhood trauma. High rates of sexual victimization have also been evidenced in longitudinal studies of young men involved in various forms of delinquency, including joyriding, burglary, making obscene phone calls, physical assaults, and other forms of antisocial behavior. There have also been evidence in psychiatric studies of arsonists, cross-sectional studies of illicit substance users, and more latterly, life history analyses of men who perpetrate domestic abuse. Disruptions to education, admission to institutional care, and the estrangement from family that can follow attempts to disclose sexual assaults or run away from abusers can consolidate the risk factors that lead some young male survivors to become repeatedly victimized and to persistently reoffend. Sexual abuse is also used to exploit or groom vulnerable young men to undertake risky activities in illicit economies, such as delivering drugs or exacting physical retribution on the behalf of others, generating high prevalence rates of repeat sexual assault victimization among male care leavers, gang members, and paramilitaries. Similar forms of exploitation underpin the most common form of sexual assault within British prisons and young offender institutes. Brutal prisoner on prisoner intimate searches are inflicted on those who smuggle illicit goods inside their bodies and drugs inside their bodies, often under the threat of retribution if they do not deliver. As undisclosed sexual trauma is compounded with acute anxiety, depression, fears of being judged as weak, self blame, internalized homophobia, and problems with intimacy, male survivors of sexual assault can find themselves in conflict with or estranged from the loved ones who might help them access support or contain feelings of rage. Disruptive and aggressive behaviors that keep anyone trying to get close at bay, vigilantism, self harm, and suicidal ideation can all be quite symptomatic of prior experiences of sexual victimization that male survivors have yet to fully process. These are the crisis points at which male prisoner survivors often approach the outspoken talking therapy service that delivers across the Northwest Prisons estate in England. Outspoken therapy is informed by Herman's three-stage model of trauma-informed therapy. This demands that no other therapeutic works should even be attempted until a reasonable degree of safety has been achieved by the survivor. Emotional and physical self-care, basic health needs, sleep, eating, and exercise, as well as the management and control of post-traumatic symptoms and control of self-destructive behaviors, have all to be redressed before any attempt to explore past trauma is pursued by the therapist. This is relentless work in prison environments where threats to mental and bodily integrity are routinely directed at those who reveal themselves to be vulnerable. Only once clients have stabilized should they attempt to face the past, reconstructing the trauma to slowly reassemble a narrative from what can seem like fragmented components and frozen imagery. This mental processing inevitably brings a descent into mourning as survivors grieve multiple losses, including the loss of bodily integrity that abuse inflicts, the premature loss of childhood innocence, the absence or deaths of important people in their lives, and the painful discovery that some relationships, once presented as loving and caring, were, in practice, acutely exploitative. Thereafter, clients in trauma focused therapy begin the central task of the third stage of Herman's model, reconnection. Though this can be a particular challenge for serving prisoners, given how restricted their access to other people they can trust enough to share aspects of their new life narrative usually is. So, what has our research design actually entailed? Well, since 2022, we have been working with We Are Survivors to develop an evaluation that would also address the wider question of how therapeutic change can be rendered meaningful for male sexual assault survivors who are also prisoners. Our design to date has involved 4 key stages. The first stage involved profiling the population of 1,050 clients who access the Outspoken service over a 3-year window, men who access the service for support with rape and sexual abuse. In terms of their demographic characteristics, we've been looking at their histories of victimisation and offending, and we've been looking at their levels of engagement with therapy. In the second phase of our project, we conducted semi-structured interviews with 12 professionals about the challenges facing the delivery of the Outspoken service. And in the third stage of the project, we started measuring the changes that clients were experiencing, changes in levels of anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, self-reported by over 350 prisoner survivors who'd undertaken the Outspoken therapy. In the fourth stage of our project, and probably the most complex stage of our project, we started listing in-depth interview accounts, biographical accounts of change for prisoner survivors at 2 initial time points, with the option of a third follow-up interview 8 to 12 months later. Our project will continue until 2029, when we anticipate a much larger sample of in-depth interviews with prisoner survivors to have been completed. We as survivors shared with us a data set that contained entries for 2,479 referrals to the Outspoken service between 2021 and 2024. The service accepts referrals from all trauma survivors, enabling men who are unsure if they've been sexually assaulted or who do not want other prisoners to know whether they have or they haven't to seek support within prisons. Around half of those referred into Outspoken do reveal at some point to have suffered a sexual assault, amounting to 350 potential clients per year into the Outspoken service. Many survivors do not engage with the service after the initial referral stage. Each year, around 60 to 70 new prisoner survivor clients undertake 11 or more Outspoken sessions, around 40 of whom will undertake 16 or more sessions out of a possible 20. So who uses the Outspoken talking therapy service? Well, 82% of Outspoken clients are victims of childhood sexual abuse. 1 in 5 are victims of sexual abuse in adulthood. They are men who were abused as adults. And about 7% of clients have been sexually assaulted in custodial settings. Around 90% of their abusers are boys and men, though in around about 5% of cases there are both male and female abusers. Around 40% of clients are serving time for violent offences, but many have diverse offending histories. And at least 16% of clients are serving time for sexual offences, so this figure is probably a bit higher given that 10% of clients refuse to disclose their index offences upon assessment. Those who do have convictions for sexual offences tend to engage more with the therapy once it is started than other groups of prisoners. Indeed, engagement in the programme does vary across different demographic groups. So we know that the intervention tends to recruit gay and bisexual men, but rates are a little bit higher than might be expected given the demographic profile of the UK's prison population. It also under-recruits men from minority ethnic backgrounds and foreign national offenders relative to their representation in the general and the prison population. It tends to secure lower levels of engagement from minority ethnic clients at present relative to those who identify as white and British. Though there have been barriers to engagement in the service over the last few years, there is much pride in how far the Outspoken service has come in a very short space of time among commissioners, among allied prison staff, and among the therapeutic team themselves. While commissioners have noted the service's ability to address competing priorities in the NHS and the prison service, weaving together a response to prisoners' histories of offending, health, trauma, as well as violence and self-harm. Trustees that we interviewed reflected on the service's ability to weather very many storms, including the challenges posed by austerity and big high-profile cases of sexual assault and abuse, which tend to generate real sudden spikes in demand for the service. Commissioners noted the role played by Outspoken in engaging men who will not engage with mainstream healthcare services in the way that they are designed to, and emphasised the importance of the work of the therapy team does to support prisoners whose wellbeing issues are hidden or shrouded in shame. The service's leadership has played a key role in working through with stakeholders the need to provide therapeutic support to men who are perpetrators of sexual violence who are also survivors, and they did this before the Outspoken service was launched, noting the challenges faced by prison staff running establishments that house a growing number of men with convictions for sexual offences. Inevitably, most clients do present with complex needs, some with very retributive feelings towards abusers in their past, or racked with guilt for things they too have done, while also contending with the very real lived trauma of being in the prison. Unlike therapists working in community settings, outspoken therapists have to anticipate that clients who have expressed vulnerability in the therapy room will return to wings that are not safe. They must always be cognizant that surveillance from fellow prisoners and some prison staff who seek to exploit weaknesses can deter clients from expressing vulnerability. This is not helped by working rooms that are more akin to, as one person said, disgusting storage spaces for broken furniture than therapeutic spaces. While many prison staff do support the work of outspoken, therapeutic staff observe that other prison professionals rarely have the time or money to be able to provide the holistic support needed to safely support prisoners' care. And in many prison environments that are male dominated and control orientated, some prison staff are cautious about engaging emotionally with prisoners, confining their support for the service to literally unlocking and locking. In turn, outspoken therapists do take considerable pride in the creativity they bring to instill the internal sense of safety. Clients need to become stable enough to revisit their past traumas, practicing box breathing techniques, progressive muscle relaxation, providing crayons or craft exercises to help prisoners reconnect with aspects of their childhoods. Psychoeducation about the ways the nervous system works can also play a role. Mindfulness and other techniques for emotional regulation are much needed by clients who fear who fear quite daily that they are going mad, sweating adrenaline, or wound up like a corkscrew. There are, of course, limits to the self-care strategies that prisoners can adopt within custody. As a prison chaplain noted in our interviews, prisoner survivors can't just have a private phone call or go round to somebody's house or go for a walk by the river. Some outspoken clients do use illicit substances after therapy sessions to manage overwhelming emotions, presenting additional challenges both for prison staff and therapists alike. And some therapists had worked with a few prisoners who were approaching release, and they did so with a view to trying to help them connect with somebody out there who could be very proactive in providing support. This is not the norm. This is not something that the service routinely offers to clients. Too many prisoners shipped around to different prisons before their release, disrupting the therapeutic process. So, what impact does the service have on prisoner survivors' levels of anxiety, depression, and PTSD? Well, you could say there are good reasons to be skeptical as to whether anything can truly work to alleviate post-traumatic stress disorder in carceral settings, prison settings, that trigger all the fears and trauma many survivors live with daily. But as an NHS commissioned service, the Outspoken service is obliged to assess the extent to which its clients reliably recover from anxiety, depression, and PTSD, as measured against the criteria set out in the NHS Talking Therapies for Anxiety and Depression manual. To assess these impacts, we analysed the scores of 387 outspoken clients who had undertaken 2 or more therapy sessions in a 3-year window. Therapy attendance amongst these men ranged from 2 to 40 sessions and averaged at about 11.72 sessions, so 12 sessions if you want to round that up. Multiple paired sample t-tests revealed statistically significant reductions in anxiety, depression, and PTSD among this cohort, irrespective of their index offences, irrespective of their survivorship histories, or their sexual orientations, or their faiths. In statistical terms, then, the changes observed yielded medium to large effect size, confirming that in general, survivors of sexual assault who attend Outspoken do secure improvements in their mental well-being that are highly unlikely to be due to chance. Far fewer, however, meet the stiffer NHS criteria for reliable recovery. This requires not just improvements, but the crossing of clinical thresholds that constitute caseness. Over 3 years, just 30 outspoken clients had reliably recovered on all 3 measures. Around half of those who undertook 16 or more sessions reached the NHS thresholds for reliable recovery for anxiety and for depression. and that is good news. But PTSD is harder to recover from amongst this particular client group. Only a third of those who attended 16 sessions reliably recover from PTSD, unsurprisingly, given how criminalisation and prison conditions contribute to poor outcomes on measures like having strong negative beliefs about oneself, blaming oneself for stressful experiences, feeling distant or cut off from other people, and being super alert, on guard, jumpy, or easily startled. Those outspoken clients who recover from PTSD were more likely to be survivors of childhood sexual abuse and exploitation than survivors of assaults perpetrated on them more recently as adults in the community, or even more recently so in custody. The mental health of male prisoner survivors who had been convicted of sexual crimes tended also to improve less steadily than prisoner survivors serving time for non-sexual offences, though, as our in-depth interviews revealed, the need to come to terms with having also inflicted harms was a reckoning that extended also to those who sold drugs and those who had perpetrated grievous or lethal assaults. Among the prisoner survivors we interviewed, coming to terms with sexual victimization meant not only confronting the shame of abuse and the feelings of helplessness it engendered, but also the guilt involved in contemplating how harms done to others and the affliction of pain that echoed their own experiences of domination, brutalization, and exploitation. 5 of the 9 outspoken survivors we have interviewed to date had killed people. 2 their partners and 2 further had hospitalized victims they had assaulted. 2 had committed sexual crimes, 1 against a sibling. 3 were involved in dealing Class A drugs. All but 1 had suffered child sexual abuse, and 5 of those had suffered child sexual abuse in institutions. 4 had been abused in custodial institutions, including Borstal, youth detention centres, and police custody. 1 during his current sentence. All of the men we interviewed were struggling to come to terms with harms perpetrated against them and harms they themselves had perpetrated. Ash, who was sexually terrorized by an older half brother, had not only sexually assaulted his younger siblings, but had also discovered, upon his conviction for murder, that the woman he had stabbed was also sexually abused by her father. When such unthinkable knowns could be contemplated, prisoner survivors became extremely grateful to their therapists, thanking them profusely for changing or saving their lives. This salvation that our interviewees described to us included becoming less substance dependent, processing what had happened to them, recognizing that the sexual abuse that they'd been subjected to wasn't their fault, weathering difficult disclosure journeys, and coming to understand a lot more about themselves, including self acknowledgement of aspects of really good character. Stabilization activities helped male survivors recognize the symptoms of PTSD, like flashbacks and nightmares, panic attacks, heart palpitations, and sweating, and enabled them to sit with their feelings of uncontrollable rage that might otherwise have culminated in attacks on fellow prisoners and prison staff perceived to have slighted them. Aidan, who was serving 14 years for the murder of a man he'd found in bed with his wife, explained how therapy had enabled him to untangle the big ball of emotions successive experiences of abuse in institutional care and criminal justice settings had afflicted him with, compartmentalizing his trauma into manageable parts that enabled him to let go of the tougher protector personalities he'd assumed. These personalities had made him want to hurt someone again, to destroy their brains in, he said, to leave a message so everyone else could see it. Aidan really commended his therapist for creating a safe environment in what were otherwise very unwelcoming prison rooms, where he could explore his past for the first time in the 37 years since he'd been stripped and raped by 6 night staff at Children's Remand Centre. For Aidan, the pains of his own victimisation paled in comparison to the guilt he still felt about smaller and weaker boys who were less able to fight back than he was, these boys being taken every night once the abusers decided to leave him, Aidan, alone. He considered this vicarious trauma to be the worst part of his time in institutional care. Likewise, it had taken Ethan 17 years to accept that he'd been groomed into sexual interactions with his father's friends and to find the confidence to declare, "I'm a survivor now." In therapy, Ethan had discovered how the frustration and pain that stemmed from being abused was misdirected at suspected sex offenders against whom he mounted vigilante attacks. He said, "I've always lashed out towards them sort of people because of what I went through." Similarly, for Carl, a gambler, who turned to drug dealing to pay off his debts, the therapy he'd received had enabled him to shift from blaming himself for the almost daily abuse his now deceased dad had perpetrated against him, to understanding it was not his fault. He'd used role play with his therapist, and that had enabled him to ask, at least hypothetically, his abuser why he did it. Transformations were rarely absolute, however, not least because homophobia complicates coming to terms with sexual assault for many male survivors. Some men began the interviews by describing their sexual orientation as normal and then straight, despite having accepted some form of intimacy, even if abusive, from a man at earlier points in their lives. Mark, who only began identifying as openly gay after he was imprisoned for murder, asked rhetorically, what was it about him that had encouraged a stranger to think he would want to be molested? Because his parents implied homosexuality was something dirty and seedy, Mark seemed not to recognise the extent to which homophobia inflected his decision to twice stab a male lover with whom he was in a clandestine relationship. Rob, who had served 19 years for murder, still wondered if the child sexual abuse he'd suffered in institutional care had made him bisexual, his mother not believing that he'd been serially raped. Likewise, Daniel, a burglar and a drug dealer, had twice committed to marrying different women while at the same time harbouring fantasies about becoming a rent boy after he was raped by a man whose hotel room he had entered. Most tragically, some men only confronted what had happened to them when they discovered that their own children were being abused. After Rob's children were placed in the care of another family member, it materialised that they were being sexually abused by their older cousins. Upon learning his worst fears had been realised, Rob went absolutely mad as the hurts of his past were opened back up again. One of his daughters was found to be cutting themselves, a horrendous living nightmare that enlivened murderous retributive fantasies for Rob. Another common nightmare for male victims of institutional child sexual abuse was the discovery that their abusers were no longer alive, a source of resentment that was routinely triggered by news coverage of arrests of high-profile sex offenders. Some of the most embittered men we interviewed revealed the intricacies of the challenges therapists face in unraveling fantasies of revenge that would have magically righted abusive wrongs done by repositioning those capable of exacting retribution as misunderstood moral heroes. Such murderous fantasies typically involve the killing of state actors and father figures who not only abused them, but made them feel culpable for the consequences that unfolded. Now, for all of those abused as children, there was no prior pre-abuse state of mental wellness to which they could safely recover to, though some, like Aidan, explained how therapy had brought them to a crossroads at which they had been helped to take another junction. Not all of those in outspoken therapy reached this junction, however. Ian, who had raped and killed a woman he assumed to be his girlfriend in a graveyard some 30 years ago, still found it easier to claim that the incident was so horrendous that his brain switched off than admit what he had done. From Ian's perspective, the bigger injustice was that the teacher who had raped him, and who was charged with almost 200 sexual abuse counts, escaped justice by hanging himself in a garage. There were few people left in Ian's life with whom he could reconnect, except his now very elderly mother, and hence it was no surprise to us when he was recalled to custody within weeks of his release to an approved premise. Likewise, Mark's family had begun distancing themselves from him at his trial. His sister, who was the only family member who really accepted his sexuality, having also refused to visit him in prison. Rob had divorced his third wife, instructing her to get on with her life and not wait while he was stuck inside. And Daniel's relationship with his family had become distant as he had become substance dependent to numb the pain he felt in the aftermath of a rape he had barely disclosed. Lacking strong social connections on the outside, most of the male survivors we spoke to used what they had learned in therapy to connect better with other men in prison. Ben, for example, became an active peer mentor for the Drug and Alcohol Recovery Service. Ethan became an equalities rep. Rob self-styled himself as something of an agony aunt on the wings directing men to outspoken. And Daniel began advocating for LGBTQ rights. To conclude then, our analysis reveals that the mental well-being of male prisoner survivors of sexual assaults significantly improves when 11 or more trauma-informed therapy sessions are undertaken. It also reveals that with 16 or more sessions, a substantial minority can reach the NHS thresholds for reliable recovery on anxiety, depression, if not so often, on post-traumatic stress disorder. Though internalized homophobia, together with assumptions about the ways in which men should embody dominance, invulnerability, and emotional stoicism, pose additional barriers to recovery for male survivors in prisons, therapy can help challenge these expectations as clients learn self acceptance and work to change the cultural norms in male dominated institutions that are otherwise often quite resistant to change. Nevertheless, the presumption that male prisoner survivors of sexual assaults who have often endured repeated experience of victimization, exclusion, trauma, and criminalization can simply recover through brief therapy is self-evidently misguided. Indeed, when recovery is reduced to an as the crow flies statistical measure of a journey, that is in reality rarely ever linear, involves many false starts, misconnections, and the crossing of the often bewildering landscapes survivors take en route to a destination that can never represent a return to some harmonious pre-abusive homestead. We do those brave enough to enter therapy a massive disservice. Delivering to and for male prisoner survivors entails overcoming significant obstacles that include the lack of therapeutic spaces in prisons, security concerns, the difficulties of keeping who accesses these kinds of services confidential, and the big social and emotional hurdles that survivors face in coming forward in institutions where it's dangerous for men to admit vulnerability. As institutions that promote exclusion and often homophobia as well, and which tarnish male survivors with the stigma associated with sex offenders, it is questionable whether prison therapists can always aid recovery, or whether they can ever do enough in justice systems that do not recognise the many harms previously inflicted on the men who typically commit the most serious crimes. All of the prisoner survivors we have interviewed were going to be at least middle-aged upon release, and most, given the gravity of their offending, were never going to be free from surveillance and the risk of recall. All, however, were deserving of therapeutic support. All had experienced sexual violation and the injustice of no one being held to account for it. Without offers of support for this past victimisation, men subject to imprisonment are liable to regard their punishment as unjust and become resistant to undertaking the emotional labour needed to contemplate the various harms that they themselves had inflicted on others. Empowering male survivors to become outspoken about the abuse that they had suffered is a crucial first step in holding both perpetrators and institutions to account for the harms done to victims, including inadequate responses to their disclosures. Persuading others to listen to them means widening our preconceptions about who survivors are and recognizing that when inadequately supported, some male survivors sadly do become the perpetrators of serious harms. So I'll end this presentation here just by saying a word of thanks to everybody who has supported the research and everybody who has participated in the research. I hope you found the presentation useful. If you would like to see copies of our reports, then please do reach out and get in touch with me at the email address on this slide. Thank you very much.